With our story winding down, as we've observed, Humongous Entertainment had a great amount of highs during its zenith. But things started going wrong around the turn of the millennium, when its parent company, GT Interactive, amidst financial troubles, was purchased by the French-based Infogrames. While they still turned out some good games, there was a lot more executive interference, to the point where they weren't able to release new games into the market as much as they did before. In fact, there is one the company made that had so long fallen into obscurity, many people were unaware of its existence, and it perfectly exemplifies how bad Infogrames' resistance and interference was making everything. And that was Moonbase Commander. It's your basic top-down turn-based strategy game, where, on the moon, each player has a base, which they can expand on by adding new buildings with specialized abilities, be they radar towers, energy collectors, or missile launchers, all of which are connected to a main base hub, which also has the ability to create new buildings via dotted power cables. The only catch though is each hub has a limited number of cables and they aren't allowed to overlap, thus requiring some care when it comes to their placement. The main goal of it is pretty simple: eradicate everyone else's bases before they eradicate yours, while also continuously defending and keeping yours functional. The last one still standing is the winner. Again, very simple and basic. Now, like with the Backyard Sports video, this'll just be going over the history of this game's production and what ultimately led to its failure. Anyways, on with the story. The idea for the project was born in the mind of Rep Mathis, who began work on it in the fall of 1999, around the time GT Interactive was in the midst of its financial troubles. By giving great focus on the basic architecture, he coded the primary launching mechanics, user interface, and the camera navigation, all of which he did inside the SCUM, something very few thought could be achieved on the engine. By the time he completed it, Mathis had made enough progress. How much? Well enough to convince himself to continue forward on it. So, he next worked on the game's core units and the basic rules for the gameplay. He even took the time to paint the game's sprites and make them passably appealing. This also had the dual effect of making the game more readable and helped give it a stronger sense of identity. Even in its then current state, it was already looking and playing like a finished game. Within less than 6 months, Rhett had made a fully functioning vertical slice all on his own. The craziest thing about all of this is that, at the time Rhett was making it, he wasn't supposed to be. Oh, don't worry, he wasn't breaking any rules, it was just he was working on it during the holiday season, when most of his colleagues were off from work. That's how passionate he was about it. During its development, and just before GT was purchased by Infogrames, Rep was introduced to 2 other Humongous colleagues, Chad Verrill and Darby McDevitt, both of whom were working on the Junior Sports Network at the time. After getting acquainted with the two, he asked them if they could play the latest version of his prototype, to which they said yes. So he sends the link to them, and after 15 minutes of gameplay, Verrill and McDevitt weren't just impressed, they were completely hooked, to the point where they became the game's official testers. Not to mention, they all felt that this game could be the future of Humongous Entertainment. Over the next 2 months, they spent a good amount of each day playing the game and hammering out a new build, though at the cost of their regular office duties, as well as report some new findings back to Mathis and discuss some of their impressions and concerns. After a few more months go by, it became clear for Rhett that his project, not his assigned work, was driving his passion. So much so that instead of giving in to pressure and refocus his attention as the lead programmer of one of Humongous' biggest franchises, he made a very bold decision. Rep was going to step down from his lead duties and continue on his personal project. but he also agreed to work full-time on whatever other project he was assigned to by the HR department, specifically by programmer manager Betsy Warren. This was a risky gamble, since it was at the point Humongous was still transitioning to the new management. But fortunately, Warren was fine with his decision and assigned him to a new project under the guise of a new lead. Now, with more time to give to the project, Mathis had one long-term vision for the game: make it for an older audience. He felt Humongous was capable of making games that could appeal to a wider and broader audience, and saw Moonbase as the bridge that would transition the young fans of the backyard sports and junior adventures into more mature strategy games. This was also seen as the perfect opportunity for both the consumers and developers, since the morale and motivation of the latter had been on a decline for half a year by that point. However, later in August, there was a startling upset. Darby McDevitt, one of Rhett's biggest supporters and advocates of Moonbase, resigned from Humongous and took an associate producer job at a smaller company called No Wonder. However, before he left, during his resignation meeting, the HR rep asked if there was anything that would encourage him to stay at the company, and McDevitt asked for just one thing: a guarantee that Moonbase would get officially greenlit, be properly staffed, and released intact. If they did so, he'd be happy to stay and join the team. Unfortunately, that last bit didn't end up happening because the rep then asked why he was leaving, and he said that he found another job at another game company. Thus, McDevitt left Humongous for good that afternoon. Not long after his departure, rumors about the game's quality started bouncing around the office space, and more employees got their hands on it, and it inevitably got the attention of one of the company's higher-ups. Come that autumn, and Andy Hayek, vice president of Humongous at the time, wrote a cordial email to Rhett about his project, which was a good sign, and after a few chats and email exchanges, Hayek suggests Rhett show it to a newly appointed producer, Jonathan Barron, who had been hired away from Electronic Arts. When they met in their first meeting, Mathis immediately took notice of Barron's passion and wisdom, which had an immediate effect on him. What also helped was that Barron was the first Infogrames emissary to convince him that his heart was in the right place, and that he would assess the game's worth on its own merits, rather than basing it off of brand viability, assumed profitability, or market share. In fact, the only aspects Barron wanted to know were the basics. Was the game fun, and could it be sold to the right people? Another thing that came out of their first meet and greet was that John gave Rhett a full rundown on how to formulate a full pitch for the game. Over the next few weeks, Rhett learned all of the ins and outs of game development, and from there, he and John worked together on a comprehensive assessment of the project, and once they worked out one that was worth showing, they scheduled the pitch meeting. Now, this is where it starts to get a little complicated. When the day of the meeting came, with Barron by his side, Rhett gave a full rundown of the game's premise, its mechanics, strategic depth, and his hopes for its future. Once he finished, Andy questioned some of the various aspects. Why? Well, he didn't like Moonbase's setting and found the cartoony retro quiche of the Moonbase units to be cold and uninviting. Also, he wanted it to be more in line with Humongous's established catalog, a game that was warm and bright, inoffensive, and kid and parent approved. But he did recognize that Rhett did design an underlying game system of some merit, so he suggested it should have an alternate setting. And what was it he suggested? A garden theme, with the bases being flower patches and having the shields be domes of honey. As you can imagine, Rhett was very livid about the suggestions. Before Andy continued on, Rhett stood up and yelled, and I quote, Why a moonbase? Because the moon is cool. Moonbases are cool. Spaceships are beepin' cool. That's why. After the conversation cooled down, much to Mathis's surprise, Andy gave him the thumbs up. It looked like things were starting to look up for the game. Jumping ahead to the spring of 2001, months before the big layoffs would hit, Rep was given the news that he would now be pitching his game to the CEO of Infogrames, Bruno Banal, in Los Angeles. Rep was terrified at the idea, but with John Barron continuing to back him, he was willing to give it a try. So, for a few days, they went over the format before Rep thought up of a real winner. You see, Rep wasn't satisfied with what he could demonstrate with just a PowerPoint presentation. So, he made the unusual choice of making a presentation inside the Moonbase engine, as this would allow him to show segments of gameplay complete with overlays for key points, thus letting him do the pitch over the top of a live in-engine replay. It took a lot of work and Red had to work overtime, but it was all worth it, and even John was impressed with what he had done. Once they got it running smoothly, they set the date of the meeting for the last week of May. For Red, it was truly stressful. He had never been put in that kind of moment before, where all of his years of hard work were about to come down to a single meeting. On the day he arrived for said big meeting, Red noticed that all of the computers had spreadsheets and recognized several executives, and that's when he realized he had been invited to a budget session. Nevertheless, Rep passed out the info sheets and proceeded to play the demo. At the end of the presentation, he opened the floor to questions, and Bruno piped in and asked, "Where's the strategy?" Rep was very incredulous by the comment. After all, everything about the game was right there in that demo, to the point where the strategic values were pretty self-evident. However, before he said anything, one executive from the then recently acquired Atari spoke up and said that there's something there, while another complimented the art and stated that it could practically be shipped as it is, which didn't sit well with Rhett. By the end, Bruno thanked him for his time and told him, "We'll investigate further." After that, Rhett hopped a plane back to Seattle. 2 weeks later, on June 13th, 82 Humongous employees were laid off, thoroughly decimating employee confidence and bringing morale to its lowest point. But not all of it was bad news. A few days prior, Red had learned what Bruno's statement at the end of their meeting meant. They were going to do consumer marketing tests. This was great news, as it showed that Infogrames was willing to give Moonbase a fair chance. However, Red had some reservations about the process, as the first test for it was for a new Humongous-style adventure game character. This was far from ideal. Red had conceived Moonbase from day one as a game aimed for teens and adults, something that would grab the attention of blooming gamers growing out of the junior adventure games and getting into more competitive games. However, the marketing team didn't provide that, and instead brought in the regular posse of 8 to 12-year-olds, asked them about their gaming habits, and showed them a few slides of concept art. If the testing failed, that would have been the end of Moonbase. But even in lieu of that, Red still wanted Moonbase to succeed no matter what happened. Thus, on that testing day, Red went down to the monitoring room and witnessed that the testing was not going well. They didn't show a demo of the game itself, but rather asked them a set of questions illustrated with a few screenshots. And the kids were very bored. If anything, their responses right there would have ended it all for Moonbase. Fortunately though, marketing had a concession and made the bold and unusual choice to allow Red to guide the next round of tests himself. When he did so, he came prepared with another demo for these ones. Rep personally led the kids through a specially prepared presentation, and afterwards, he got exactly the results he wanted. But marketing didn't get it. Miraculously though, Red's interference didn't completely invalidate the results. Someone had written up an encouraging report and forwarded that to another person, who in turn approved the money for a more proper product analysis, using an independent marketing company. This gave Rep more cause for worry though, as the response from that group suggested that Moonbase should be in the tween to teen group. At first, this seemed like a major victory, since Humongous had never targeted users that old before. Unfortunately, they ultimately decided that the tween audience would be the target range. This, of course, knocked Rhett's hopes down a few pegs. But even with that, one message was clear from the research group: they could sell it. Finally, after 2 years of jumping through hoops, Rhett at long last got the message he wanted to hear. Moonbase had been given the green light. However, someone in marketing suggested changing the title, and hence, Moonbase would become Moonbase Commander. Now, at this point, you may be thinking that the rest will all be smooth sailing from here. Oh ho ho, you'd be wrong! Things were about to get a lot more hectic. After finally greenlighting it, Infogrames wanted the game to be done on a budget of $300,000. For Rhett, this was disappointing, as it signified a lack of commitment from Infogrames. But, always the fighter, Rhett fought back and directly told Andy that it was going to cost at least twice as much, to which he replied that it wasn't something he needed to think about in the moment. But Andy was open to some level of leeway, so the two struck a deal, and once he assembled the team, the full production got going in the fall of 2001. For the actual production, it was dense, intense, efficient, and rapid, as the game had to be done in just a few months with a small team, consisting of Pat Wiley, who managed the production and kept things moving along, Brad B. Taylor, who optimized Scum's sprite renderer to accommodate the quasi-3D look, engineer Daryl Milner, who handled the enemy AI, artist Cisco Martinez, who updated the look and feel of Rhett's original art and handed it over to texture artist Mark Lautenbeck, and modelers Dan Cole and Jim Miller once they were approved, Kristen Heavenstreet and Ben Young, who refactored the UI and menus, and the testing team: Pat Hoynes, Steve Kuo, Jeff McCrory, Robert Oakes, and Chad Verrill, whom contributed to the game's multiplayer maps. Lastly, though only for a short time, Brad Carlton came on board as a writer and added personality to the 4 warring factions. Work continued through the winter and into the spring of 2002 at a pace that everyone, even Red, was impressed with. Around this point, Infogrames announced they were aiming the game for a summer release of that year. Rep was grateful for the apparent support and confidence, as this would also give Humongous a chance to present the game to the press at E3 in June of that year. However, before all of that, backing up a bit to late April, one of Humongous's top executives called all of the senior leads down for an impromptu pep talk. He wanted to show them a game he thought could signal the future of the company, a sort of signpost for what they could do. When everyone was present and seated, the executive pointed up to the screen and said to them, "This is what we want from the company. This is the sort of thing Humongous should be making." What game was he showing them? Oh, just a little unknown commodity you've probably heard of called Kingdom Hearts. After the opening movie, there was nothing but silence. Now, the crew didn't think the game wasn't exciting or felt they had the talent to do a game like that. Quite the contrary. It was just at that point, Humongous, in its current state, was financially incapable of making one like that. So, what was intended to rally up the company's morale and spirit ended up making the crew sputter and fume more, and created a sense of hopelessness. But that didn't stop Rhett, as he and the team continued their work on Moonbase Commander. Okay, getting back to the E3 announcement, the timing of the E3 Expo couldn't have been more perfect. The popularity of sci-fi themed strategy games were at an all-time high, so Moonbase Commander seemed poised to make a big splash. Plus, with it nearly being finished, it didn't need a demo or special presentation. All they needed was to get a few dozen journalists to play it for just 15 minutes, and there would be no question they'd found their audience. But there was one big thing holding it back: Infogrames themselves. When Rhett got a look at a draft of the final E3 presentation, Moonbase Commander wasn't on it. The message he got from that was as clear as day. Infogrames had no idea what to do with the game, or didn't plan to do anything with it at all. So, like many times before in this story, Rhett took things into his own hands and contacted Pat Hoynes, who had been tasked to demo their upcoming titles at E3, gave him a copy of Moonbase, and asked him to do one simple task: show the game to anyone he could. Unfortunately, Pat's duties at the booth kept him occupied for much of the event, until the third day when he managed to get Penny Arcade's Tycho and gave him a quick preview. After playing a couple of matches, Tycho left impressed. Pat shared this story with Rhett, and he was touched, as this was the first time someone outside Humongous was able to play it. However, that wasn't enough of a push to help out Moonbase Commander. As the game approached its release date, there were clear signs that Infogrames had zero interest in the game. The marketing team wasn't interested in getting a clear message out to the right people, as the initial box art and text were designed for third graders and ads were planned for parenting magazines. The team tried to appeal to marketing on how far they were missing the point, but they weren't going to change their campaign. They did, however, let Rhett change the box art after several emails and arguments, but they remained steadfast on aiming the game at 8 to 12-year-olds. None of that mattered though, as in the final month prior to the release, the marketing push was so minuscule it was essentially non-existent. And when the game finally landed on the moon on August 13th, 2002, there would be no buzz or press coverage for it. Thanks to the minuscule marketing and lack of push, almost nobody knew about it, and it inevitably failed big time, only having a market value between $0 and $100,000. On the bright side though, critics gave the game great reviews, praising the gameplay, its ability to really encourage strategic thinking, and for being just overall exciting and engaging. The game would win some awards, including Best Budget Game from Computer Game Magazine, and won both IGN's and GameSpot's award for Best Game No One Played. Despite its unjustifiable failure, Moonbase Commander would get a second chance at life, as there would be downloadable copies for sale on Atari's official website. Later on, the game was sold off to Rebellion Developments, and then eventually re-released on Steam in 2014 in its complete unabridged form, with the full original gameplay, single-player campaigns, and local multiplayer. Moonbase Commander is the most unique entry of Humongous Entertainment's library, as it showed that the company was capable of making games for an older audience, and is a prime example of how disinterest from the higher-ups can ruin a game's chance of success. But it currently lives on, finding a new audience and becoming a cult favorite.